Jana is a professor of history at the Tulane University. She's written about Vietnamese and Cuban refugees in the United States. One of her books analyzes the transit of Vietnamese refugees to the United States after 1975. Jana, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I do not have a PowerPoint. I'm hoping that I like to actually, even when I'm on Zoom, try to interact. So here I am. I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'm a U.S. historian. I have studied the history of U.S. of refugees to the United States for over a decade. And I should start by saying this is a really difficult moment. For those of us who study migration and refugees in the United States, it's clear, obviously, the government is hostile at the moment, to say the least, on refugees and migration policy. But I'm going to turn us to the past and think a little bit about a longer history about refugees in the United States. And I think in some ways, unsettle a few of our assumptions, and then I'll end by saying some final remarks about my thoughts on the naval base in Guantanamo Bay. So I just want to begin my first book. The book I want to talk about today is a book called In Camps: Vietnamese Repatriates, Refugees, and Asylum Seekers. This is a book which looks at the Vietnamese refugee stories after the U.S. war in Vietnam and all the way until the 1990s. This is very much a story of the Cold War, but I would argue that it complicates many ways the way we think about Cold War refugees. So just to put a few things on the table, with the UN Convention on Refugees in 1951, this is the international definition. People who are needing refuge because they fear political persecution, as well as very clear categories. But the United States does not sign on to the 1951 convention. They do sign on to the 1967 protocol. But most of U.S. refugee policy between 1945 and 1980 happens through executive authority. And this is because the U.S. president is able to grant parole admissions to those that he thinks should be able to enter the United States. And so, for example, Hungarians who come to the United States after the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, they are given parole authority. Cubans who come in 1959 come in under an executive parole authority. And this will happen again for Vietnamese. And in the United States, I think that there is an assumption, because the Vietnamese who come to the United States are seen as anti-communist refugees, in many ways bolstering U.S. Cold War ideology, that they are de facto refugees. This, however, is not true. They come in initially as parolees, and even after that, I would say that their status, while far more privileged than migrants coming from Central America or from Mexico, or, for example, people who had refugee status in Canada as Chileans leaving after the overthrow of Allende. Cold War politics very much frame U.S. policy, but even then it's not as certain, and it changes over time. So what my work does is it makes three central arguments. First, I look at how refugee status changes, even for the most privileged of refugees. In this case, those assumed to be anti-communist, coming at the end of the U.S. war in Vietnam. Secondly, I look at refugee activism. I look at the ways that people, both in camps and in the diaspora, advocate and actively shift the political process, advocating for the entry of people from in camps from Vietnam into the United States. And finally, I also look at the politics of host countries at first asylum sites, and the ways that those first asylum sites also reshape refugee policy. Finally, I think my work at the moment, it's the 50th anniversary of the end of the U.S. war in Vietnam. And so that adds a certain sort of retrospective sort of analysis as we look back at 50 years. So with that, just very briefly, my work begins in 1975. As I said, the Vietnamese coming into the United States in 1975 come under parole authority. And it is in fact true that the executive branch and the president had a great deal of latitude over designating who could come in as parolees and the vast majority of people who could not. And the Vietnamese are able to enter as parolees. And between 1975 and 1977, so there's about 125,000 Vietnamese come in 1975. Then there's in some ways a pause, and you'll get a large number of Vietnamese who come in 1978 and 1979. This will lead to the quote unquote boat people crisis. And the United States, along with Canada and Australia, are taking large numbers of Vietnamese in 78 and 79, but not fast enough for the host country nations, which included Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as the Philippines. And this will lead to essentially an international crisis. And the UNHCR will host a conference in Geneva in 1979. And this will lead to a very specific and special, again, privileged position for Vietnamese in these refugee camps. And essentially, this is an agreement whereby the UNHCR will guarantee that all incoming Vietnamese will be given refugee status. They also argue and commit that they will be resettled outside of the host countries. That means they will not remain in Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand. And finally, there begins a program called the Orderly Departure Program, which will be a program between Vietnam and the United States, trying to, again, minimize the numbers of people leaving by boat. But in the United States, this is seen, again, as irregular. And this will lead to the US 1980 Refugee Act that will be the main piece of legislation governing refugees in the United States. And it's very much based on this camp idea that refugees will be people in camps, and that the US could then choose which people it wants to admit, and that they will not be coming into the United States en masse. The 1980 Refugee Act also does provide the provisions for asylum, and they, in fact, underestimate the number of people in the United States who will be asking for asylum, which we will see escalate throughout the 1990s and the 21st century. So this is both the domestic policy and the international policy in 1979 and 1980. And between 1980 and 1988, again, there's this assumption that Vietnamese leaving Vietnam will be given refugee status. This is true as they go to camps in the Philippines. It'll be true as they go to camps in Hong Kong. And my case study in this regard really looks at Vietnamese who go to Hong Kong. And because of its geography, a large number of Vietnamese from northern Vietnam will go to Hong Kong. And the United States, as well as Canada and Australia, tend to be far more reluctant to accept the Vietnamese coming from Hong Kong. Because they are seen as coming from northern Vietnam. And because they're coming from northern Vietnam, they do not read as quote unquote refugees, particularly to US officials who see Vietnamese as supposed to be, from their vision, anti-communist, disproportionately Catholic, coming from South Vietnam. And this will unsettle the United States and who it sees as a refugee. And this, I guess, goes to my main argument, that even Vietnamese, who the US presume are anti-communist and are coming because of the aftermath of the US war in Vietnam, their refugee status becomes unstable. And Hong Kong, which is a British colony, increasingly becomes angry, frustrated, overwhelmed by hosting camps where they fear the Vietnamese will not be resettled because they are not being accepted as refugees. And in 1988, Hong Kong will change the policy and say that they are tired of the UNHCR agreement from 1979 that all incoming Vietnamese will be refugees, and they begin a policy of individual asylum hearings. And this will seem very typical for those of us who are in countries where there are individual asylum hearings today, where rather than seeing all Vietnamese as refugees, instead people will face individual asylum hearings. And the Hong Kong sort of polity says that If you are able to demonstrate that you face fear of persecution, yes, you are a refugee and you'll be resettled. But if you cannot prove that through your hearing, that you will have to be returned to Vietnam, that you will be repatriated. And this is a major change in UNHCR policy. In 1989, you will have an agreement called the Comprehensive Plan of Action, which will again be a meeting of both resettlement countries as well as first asylum countries. Vietnam will also be there. And they agreed to this new formula of individual asylum hearings. And so this will mean that the Vietnamese go from being automatically refugees to being asylum seekers in 1989. And this will lead to a large amount of protest, both within the camps as well as within the diaspora. And Vietnamese in the camps will use legal mechanisms. They will have legal support within Hong Kong, bringing these asylum cases. Vietnamese in the diaspora will lobby the US government as well as the Canadian and Australian governments. And this will lead to a much more complicated process whereby large numbers of Vietnamese are no longer categorized as refugees. This means that a much lesser known story is one of protest in the camps, of denial of refugee status for Vietnamese, and the repatriation of approximately 100,000 Vietnamese back to Vietnam between the years of roughly 1989 and 1996. And they're being repatriated from camps in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Indonesia. There are a few people also who are repatriated from Indonesia and smaller numbers from the Philippines. And I think that this key point recognizes that with the changing politics of the Cold War in the United States, to be honest, there's a fairly schizophrenic policy. The State Department, which has reopened diplomatic relations with Vietnam in 1995 and 1996, wants regularized relations, which also means deportations, that not every Vietnamese is seen as a refugee. On the other hand, Cold War politics remained extremely tenacious in the United States. Republican Congress members, as well as some Democratic Congress members, are extremely sympathetic to the Vietnamese in the camps in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, and continue to lobby for preferential refugee status for the Vietnamese as late as 2005. And here we can see the diasporic activism pressuring Congress to keep to a Cold War formula of who is and who is not a refugee, even after the sort of Cold War calculus has ended, and the United States in many ways is tolerating these large numbers of repatriations back to Vietnam. And so we can again see the situation changing, that Vietnamese are no longer just asylum seekers, but have become repatriates. So those are the main points of my book project, really thinking about this changing status of Vietnamese from refugees to asylum seekers to repatriates, thinking about how this juxtaposes and intersects with the changing Cold War politics, but also recognizing that Vietnamese in the camps are actively fighting for their refugee status, as well as in their resettlement countries. But it is unstable and it is changing. And it means even the most privileged of national groups who often get refugee status are having to fight for it and increasingly are not admitted as refugees. I will only end because I'm feeling extremely, I don't know, disheartened, depressed. My first book is on the naval base in Guantanamo Bay. I've also written about the base's use as a refugee camp for Haitians and Cubans in the 1990s. And I just want to suggest that what we're looking at today is frightening in terms of the denial of refugee claims, of asylum claims, and the increasing criminalization and eradication of rights for migrants in the United States. And I'm happy to speak about the naval base in Guantanamo Bay, as well as about my work on Vietnamese refugee camps and these changing politics of Vietnamese status. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jana. Yeah, we're all kind of depressed these days. Our next speaker is Daniel Jerke. Daniel is a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna. His work deals with refugees from Poland who went to Austria and Canada in the 1980s.
Yeah, all right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your introduction and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about my research today. Yeah, as Michelle said, I'm a doctoral student at the University of Vienna, and I'm working on emigration from Poland to Austria and Canada in the 1980s. And the choice of these two countries isn't as yeah, random as it may sound, because at the time during the Cold War, if you were a Pole and you wanted to emigrate to Canada, it was not so easy to go there directly. You rather had to pass through other European countries, transit countries, and one of the most important transit countries in general for people leaving the Soviet bloc on their way to North America was clearly Austria. So these countries were clearly linked by the emigration of Polish and other refugees from the Soviet bloc on their way further west. In my research, I'm particularly interested in what I like to call the precarious privileges Polish refugees were kind of faced with after their arrival in the West. What do I mean by precarious privileges? On the one hand, it's fairly easy to show that Polish refugees were favorably treated by Western state authorities. In the 1980s, Canada clearly is a very good example of this because they even wrote it into law or made it into law. In the case of the special legal category that was created in 1979, and that was called East European Self-Exiled Person. And that category existed until 1990 and was especially geared towards refugees from the Soviet bloc. And if in order to become part of this legal category, you did not have to prove individual persecution in your home country. And that was special and a special condition that just existed at the time for refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, while all other refugees from other parts of the world had to prove individual persecution. In the Austrian case, their privileged status was not written into law, but was rather kind of performed in practice by the authorities. For example, if your asylum claim had been rejected, you were still not faced with the danger of being forcefully removed, and that stood in contrast to the treatment of, let's say, rejected asylum seekers from countries like Yugoslavia or Turkey. Yeah, and these I think are just two examples how Polish refugees were privileged in the West in the 1980s, or in particular here in Austria and Canada. But by taking a closer look, we also can see that there were a lot of elements of precarity in their treatment. Take just the two examples I just talked about, because they show, in fact, a very one-sided dependence of the refugees. They were very much dependent on the respective governments in the West. And when in the late 1980s, for a number of different reasons, Western governments became less and less inclined to assist Polish refugees, that one-sided dependentness very swiftly turned into a huge disadvantage. And there was not so much the Poles could do about that. Another element of their precarity was the downward social mobility they were faced with after their arrival in the West, because on average, Polish refugees were fairly young, were highly educated, and almost exclusively hailed from urban centers. But still, they found themselves almost exclusively at the bottom of the social ladder after their emigration. So that's another very important element of their precarity. But in my dissertation, I do not just want to show why Polish refugees that they were precariously privileged. I want to go a step further, in the sense that I want to show how that ambivalence came about. And I believe that ambivalence was the result of very dynamic and complicated negotiations between different actors. And by actors, I mean different state institutions, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, of course, the media, and last but not least, the refugees themselves also try to make their voices heard, and who were clearly not just passive objects of those negotiations. Why do I think that matters? Is that in my work, I want to show the complexity behind those negotiations, because I have the impression that in most depictions of the of emigration from the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, it's often portrayed in very I would say simple, oversimplified narratives, in the sense that Poles and other refugees from the Soviet bloc were simply seen as anti-communists and as whites, and that's why they were privileged. Of course, anti-communism and race thinking played a huge role, were extremely important, but they do not explain everything, like the elements of precarity I just mentioned. And I think, yeah, it's really important to point out that the privileges the Poles enjoyed were clearly not a foregone conclusion. They had to be called for. And there are a lot of examples when, Polish refugees themselves turned to the Western authorities and said, do something for us. It was not just, as I said earlier, they were not just the object of negotiations. They also actively took part in them, and sometimes openly called for being privileged. And now to draw a line to the present, I think my research is an interesting historical case that we can learn from, because it also tells us, or it gives us a lot of insight into how refugees from Ukraine are nowadays seen in the West. And there are a lot of parallels, I would claim, with the Polish case, and a lot of differences, because of course, Poland was in a very dire situation in the 1980s, but still there was no war, there was no open, there were no destructions in any way comparable to what is now happening in Ukraine. That's a major difference. But still, I think, generally the Polish and the Ukrainian case are comparable to a certain degree, and we can learn a bit from the Polish case to better understand what is going on right now. And for the last couple of minutes of my talk, I will turn to the three questions that come up in the announcement of today's seminar. The first is, why did certain groups garner a reputation of being preferentially treated while they mostly didn't feel favored? Because that is quite obvious in my case, because I'm working quite a lot with ego documents by Polish refugees, interviews, memoirs, letters. Some of them were produced at the time, some of them later after the events described, but they clearly show that at the time and even later on, yeah, Poles didn't feel favored. And that's, of course, an interesting aspect that why they didn't feel favored despite what I just talked about, like the very open legal favors they enjoyed in a country like Canada. And I would my idea that it depended very much on their perspective, on the points of comparisons they could make, because when you were a Pole and you wanted to go to Canada and you first arrived in Austria, where you asked for asylum, because that was necessary, or that was often necessary before you could go on and apply at the Canadian embassy here in Vienna. You were, after you had submitted your asylum claim, you were brought to the infamous refugee camp here in Austria that is still in use, that is called Traiskirchen. And the living conditions at the Traiskirchen camp were very bad in the 1970s and 80s. The camp was chronically overcrowded. The hygienic and sanitary conditions, as well as the food, were really bad. There were cases of corruption and of violence and so on and so forth. So it was really not a very nice place to stay. And that's, of course, very understandable why in consequence, a lot of Poles tried to get out of there as fast as possible to get on to Canada. But some observers at the time, kind of neutral observers from a country like Canada, compared the situation at Traiskirchen with what was going on in Southeast Asia at the time. And from their perspective, Traiskirchen wasn't as bad as it seemed to the people who lived there at the time. And I assume that most Poles, even if they had heard about what was going on in Southeast Asia, I mean, it's very much understandable that from their perspective, why should they care about what was going on in refugee camps, let's say in Malaysia? So to them, the situations were so bad that kind of justified that they had to be treated favorably. But to most neutral observers to some, let's say, put it that way, to some neutral observers that came close, to being preferentially treated, despite the fact that their living conditions were, in comparison, way better than in other parts of the world. The second question from the announcement is that, is there something we can learn from these historical cases? And I can just repeat what I talked about earlier, is that I think it's very important here to show the complexity in the past as well as in the present, that there isn't just black and white, that it's always complicated. And coming back to the Ukrainians nowadays, I think when we talk about how Ukrainian refugees are nowadays seen in Western countries, it's often forgotten that the Ukrainians are, of course, not a homogeneous group, and it's way easier nowadays for or we know very well from different research, different studies and so on, that middle-class Ukrainians are from urban centers are much more likely to have made it out of their country in the first month of the war, in comparison to elderly people, to people who belong to minorities, who are not so well educated and so on. And that was the same in the 1980s with Poles. If you possessed social or economic capital, it was way easier for you to get out of Poland and to be admitted to Canada. And let's say, but if you had some form of impairment, it was almost impossible at the time to be admitted officially as a refugee to Canada, because Canada did not, or rather wanted to avoid the admission of people with physical or psychological impairments. And so there were a lot of filters at work, and that's also, I think important to talk about. And the last question I just want to answer shortly is there a way to overcome the spiral of accusations and distrust between the different groups? Because sometimes already at the time, sometimes different refugee groups accused each other of being being privileged. And one possibility, of course, would be to overcome that would be to focus rather on commonalities. And at the time, there were refugees from Poland who, after their arrival in Canada, tried to bond with refugees from places like Vietnam or Afghanistan on the cause of anti-communism. That was clearly a commonality at the time, but that was also problematic because it was sometimes directed against other refugees from other parts of Latin America, like from Chile or from El Salvador. So that was a commonality that did not only united but also divided people at the same time. But one commonality one could have focused on is the downward social mobility I already mentioned, and that was something all major refugee populations who came to Canada in the 70s and 80s suffered from. It's not only true of the Poles, it's also well proven for the Vietnamese, the Chileans, the Asian Ugandans. And to my knowledge, that aspect hasn't lost much of its significance nowadays with for example, Ukrainians. And so I think, the downward social mobility might be an aspect worth focusing on again nowadays when we talk about commonalities between different refugee populations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was really interesting. Certainly the history over the last 60, 70 years has been not simple. Our final presenter is Krenare Recaj. Krenare is, a PhD candidate at Carleton University. In her work, she compares oral testimonies of Kosovar Albanian refugees resettled to Canada with official government narratives from around the turn of the century. Interestingly enough, I was the ESL coordinator at Camp Borden when the refugees came to Canada, so that was an experience in and of itself. So Krenare, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have a PowerPoint, so if someone could just tell me that they can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, so I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Krenare Recaj, and I study migration, refugees, and diaspora. I'm a historian, and I particularly look at Kosovar refugees in Canada. But my presentation today is going to compare the treatment of refugees and those in need in Kosovo from those in need from Sierra Leone. And I want to start by saying I'm very aware of the potentials and the pitfalls of writing history by comparison. I acknowledge I'm not an expert in Sierra Leone, where I am an expert in Kosovo, but I still do think that a comparison between the two reveals something important, and it's my sincerest hope to be able to do justice to both sides. So I'd like to start with this quote. It says, "There was an outpouring of support from the Canadian public, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the arrival of the Vietnamese boat people." This quote comes from a lessons learned document that evaluates Northern Alberta's experience with Kosovar refugees. But similar quotes, I've done interviews with 50 politicians, policymakers, immigration officials, Red Cross officials, and all of them make a similar comparison and make a similar quote and say that it was something unique about the expression of support that Kosovar refugees got, both by the government and from the public. So integral to Canada's national identity is the idea that Canada is at least partially defined by welcoming people all over the world. But quotes like this and reports that say that Kosovar refugees were treated in a unique way or preferentially, it backs up that popular narrative that Canadians are defined by welcoming people from all parts of the world. But when you compare these quotes, when you compare the fact that Kosovars were treated so well, it also to other groups in need at the time, it also challenges the narrative that Canada is defined by welcoming people from all over the world. So I want to give a little bit of historical background to Kosovar refugees coming to Canada and also Sierra Leoneans coming to Canada. So in 1999, NATO launched Operation Allied Force, which was a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia intended to end the ethnic cleansing of Kosovar Albanians. Canada was a key contributor to Operation Allied Force, but during Operation Allied Force, Serbian paramilitaries forced more, they used it as an excuse to force more Kosovar Albanians out of Kosovo, which resulted in overcrowded refugee camps in the neighboring countries of Albania and Macedonia. Although initially there was hesitancy to take refugees, and initially the preference was to keep refugees in the region, eventually the overcrowded refugee camps got so bad and the conditions got so bad that the UNHCR put out an emergency call for countries to temporarily take Kosovar refugees, which resulted in the airlift of 5,051 Kosovar Albanians to Canada and 2,000 more in the coming months through a family reunification scheme. So from the moment Operation Parasol began, so Operation Parasol was that airlift, that emergency airlift, Kosovar refugees received better treatment compared to that of other refugees. In 1991, civil war began in Sierra Leone when the government in power clashed with the Revolutionary United Front. The war centered around control of profits of the diamond trade. The civil war, which lasted over 10 years, led to wide-scale human rights abuses by both the government and the RUF. In the 12 years, an estimated 2.5 million people became refugees or internally displaced persons. In 1996, Canada sent 6 Canadian Armed Forces officers to Sierra Leone as part of the United Nations mission, 5 of whom returned within a year. Canada's contribution in Sierra Leone was dismal compared to Kosovo. So again, just by going through these 2 slides, you can see how different the scale of the contribution was. There was remarkable cohesion in the support for Kosovo, for the Kosovo War in Canada, and for Canada's involvement in that humanitarian intervention. However, occasionally questions were asked about Canada's impressive commitment to Kosovo. When these questions were asked, they were usually accompanied by comparisons between Kosovo and situations elsewhere. Often elsewhere was West Africa. More specifically, Sierra Leone was the place that came up over and over again. For example, on April 12, 1999, during an impassioned speech on Kosovo, progressive conservative MP Keith Martin stated, "Kosovo is the latest of these countries, the one that is the apple of the eye of the media and the one that is drawing the most attention. It is by no means that which is going to be the greatest in terms of death and destruction in our world today. As I said before, in Sierra Leone, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and thousands more are killed every day. No one hears about that, no one talks about it, and no one cares." So this kind of shows that although there was support for humanitarian intervention, people were aware that there was a double standard being set. So the fear that Kosovo was eclipsing Sierra Leone led Liberal MP Sheila Feinstone to ask her own party's Minister of Foreign Affairs to clarify what is being done, stating, "While the world is extremely concerned about the ongoing human security issues in Kosovo, we are also very upset about what is going on and the atrocities taking place in Sierra Leone." Immigration policy and foreign policy are closely linked. That's one of my primary research interests, the overlap between the two. As such, it is not surprising that Canada's attitude toward refugees from Kosovo and refugees from Sierra Leone differed greatly. That said, the extent of the preferential treatment is still surprising and worth close examination. So on April 6, 1999, the armed forces issued a warning order putting 5 military bases on notice that they had 72 hours to prepare to receive 5,000 Kosovars for up to 6 months. Within weeks, these 5,000 refugees had arrived. After initial wavering on the part of the government, the right of landing fee, often referred to derisively as the modern-day head tax, was waived for Kosovars. Not owing the government this $975 per adult immediately put Kosovars in a better financial situation than other refugees who did have to pay it. On this slide, you can see the front page of the Ottawa Citizen warning of the biblical deluge of refugees. Headlines around the country documented how military bases were scrambling to prepare within 72 hours. There is another article on the government's decision to waive the right of landing fee being due to criticism from within their own ranks. Although there are many ways in which there was a difference in treatment towards Kosovar refugees, this presentation is going to focus on what I've classified as 6 separate ways. But of course, they are interrelated, and we can discuss those in the questions. So the ways are medical, government classification, public reception, housing, English as a second language training, and repatriation and exploratory visits. So refugees who are coming to Canada, who were coming to Canada at the time, are usually medically examined overseas before even being allowed to be put on planes and come to Canada. So the first major difference in the treatment of Kosovar refugees is that they didn't receive full medical screenings overseas. Instead, they were quickly triaged for potential needs and boarded. Once in Canada, Kosovars received extensive medical and dental treatments. Even after they left the bases, they continued to have medical and dental coverage comparable to and sometimes exceeding that of Canadian citizens. I have done interviews, so a lot of my research is based on oral history. I've done interviews with the doctors who were sent to the refugee camps in Albania and in Macedonia, and they really emphasized that the way Kosovars were treated changed their understanding of the refugee system. So one in particular told me that she had worked with many refugee groups before, and that the other refugee groups that she had worked with in Asia and Africa and South America weren't allowed on planes if they had some medical issues that made her hesitant to put Kosovar Albanians on planes, but she was told over and over again from Ottawa that nope, this is the way we're doing it, just triage them, put them on planes, and we'll deal with it when they come here. And she compares that to the fact that in her previous settings, she had to assess how much a refugee would cost the Canadian taxpayers. So she was constantly assessing how much a refugee's medical issue would cost Canadian taxpayers. And she was told for Kosovar Albanian refugees that doesn't matter. The cost doesn't matter. Canada's going to cover it. So I think that's a really poignant point when you have someone who's worked with so many refugee groups saying that like it took her a while to adapt to the headspace of like, we are treating these people differently. So another way that Kosovars were treated preferentially or benefited from the policies was through government classification. And what was a first for the Canadian government, all Kosovars were classified in the CR5 special needs category. This classification qualified them for 2 years of funded living support from the federal government through the Joint Assistantship Sponsorship Program, or the JAS. CR5 refugees are usually assessed on a case-by-case basis, and the majority only qualify for 1 year of federally funded support. In the words of one immigration official, it is uncommon for adult males to be classified as JAS. The treatment of Kosovo refugees was very unusual in that the entire group was accorded the most generous federal funding. Typically, the government is financially responsible for a fraction of the JAS refugees' time, and the sponsor is financially responsible for the rest. For example, under the pilot program for Sierra Leone, the government covered the first 4 months, and the sponsors were responsible for the remaining 8 months. Kosovars were a part of the JAS program, and they were assigned sponsors. However, they were unique in that sponsors had no financial obligation to them. So with other refugees, the sponsors had financial obligations to support the refugees for an amount of their time. So as you see on these two graphs, the government paid 4 months, and then the sponsors would pay 8 months. And then the refugee from Sierra Leone would get 12 months, so a year of support. Kosovars got double that. All of it was covered by the federal government, which also meant that people were more willing to sponsor Kosovar refugees because they didn't have to make a financial commitment. So after the other way that Kosovar refugees were treated preferentially was, that you could see their preferential treatment was also by the public, not just the government policy. After the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration released a media statement in which she appealed for Canadians to sponsor Kosovo refugees, the Canadian response was so overwhelming that a specific hotline had to be set up. Within days, there were more potential sponsors than there were refugees. One study showed that 62% of the sponsors had never been involved with sponsorship before. The same study found that this was double the number of first-time sponsors for non-Kosovar refugees, which shows that people were more willing to try to sponsor a refugee if the refugee was a Kosovar. One might assume that the increase in willingness was due to the fact that they would have no financial commitment, as I spoke about in the previous slide. However, many of the would-be sponsors did not understand that they had no financial obligations and were more than willing to share whatever they had with Kosovars. The desire to help the Kosovars was so strong that there were even hard feelings and anger amongst those who were not chosen as sponsors. Experienced sponsors expressed surprise at the help the government was during the process compared to previous experiences. So here you can see the kind of the headlines in two articles. One talks about that phones were burning up and staff were absolutely swamped with phone calls, and the other one that they were receiving 100 phone calls in a day of people wanting to sponsor refugees, and a lot of them were offering to open up their own homes, give their own clothes, share bedrooms with their own children. So it's a really interesting experience for those on the other side of the phone, because sometimes, according to those who I've interviewed, they'd ask, we have enough sponsors for Kosovo refugees, but would you be willing to sponsor a refugee from this place or that place? And the people on the other side of the phone would say, no, we really wanted a Kosovar, which is really kind of startling to think about. So more about the public reception. So charitable organizations were inundated with donations. At CFB Gagetown, 70 tons of clothing were donated. After a public request for bikes for Kosovar refugee children, Canadians flocked to the Salvation Army with donations. When volunteers asked if their donations could go to other refugee children, many donors refused, specifying that their donations were intended for the Kosovars. There were also turf wars between charities, military, and government over who got credit. The level of emotional investment and turf wars illustrate the extent of the commitment to Kosovar refugees. So what I mean by turf wars is that from my interviews and from some of the declassified documents at the time, one of the things that government officials had to manage was that if the media was giving Red Cross the credit for helping Kosovars, then some of the immigration officials felt like they weren't getting the credit. They all kind of wanted ownership over this like outpouring of support. On this slide, you can see some of the headlines covering donations. The RCMP donated 2 18-wheelers full of imitation Nikes. The same article mentions that a candy factory had donated many tons of candy. One woman spearheaded a campaign that saw more than 8,000 dolls and teddy bears donated. So think about 8,000 teddy bears. There are 5,000 refugees, including adults, and 8,000 teddy bears. So there's more than one teddy bear per person and a lot more per child. In the words of one of the volunteers that I've interviewed, the Kosovars were very popular that summer for good and for bad. So they were also treated very well or beneficially when it came to housing. So initially, Kosovar refugees were housed on military bases in Ontario and in the Maritime provinces. They were housed there for up to 3 or 4 months. That is significantly longer than other refugees have been housed on military bases. So there's a bit of a debate amongst both Kosovar refugees and immigration officials if being housed on refugee bases on military bases, which were called sustainment sites for so long, were beneficial. But most of them do think that it was beneficial because they weren't thrown into the community immediately, and they got a really high level of support during their time on sustainment sites. And then when it came to community integration, getting them out of the sustainment sites and moved into communities, provincial governments changed their typical rules for Kosovar Albanians. So although all of the provinces took kind of a different approach, all of them in some way took an approach that could be identified as better than how other refugees are housed. So despite receiving thousands of calls from Canadians offering their homes, the decision was made to house Kosovars in rental apartments immediately to respect their independence. For example, the Alberta government waived housing funding limits that they had previously refused to waive for other refugee groups. And the reason they did this was to allow Kosovars bigger houses, bigger apartments, so they could keep families together. But other refugee groups would also have benefited from not having these housing family limits. In Ontario, many were housed outside of typical social housing to allow refugees to stay together. In British Columbia, Kosovars settled into small cities, so they did not have to compete for resources with other refugees. And in Quebec, Kosovars in Gatineau were given apartments immediately, and the media in Quebec at the time showed that there were actually complaints by other refugee groups who had been waiting and were seeing that Kosovars were given apartments immediately. And then there were the last category was English as a second language training. Another policy that benefited Kosovars is the extended ESL training. Kosovars were eligible for an additional 4 months of ESL classes. English proficiency is crucial to a refugee's ability to integrate and succeed in Canada, so this extension was extremely important. Special classes were set up for Kosovars, and when they were in mixed classes, they were treated differently. While ESL programs usually had strict attendance policies, Kosovars were allowed leniency. This special treatment caused problems for the ESL teachers who were asked by other students to explain the double standards. Again, Kosovars were settled in all the provinces, and there were different experiences, but I have interviewed people from each of the provinces and also looked at the media coverage and the access to information requests and the documents. And these are, although this might not be every single person's experience, these are things that came up again and again in the interviews, or in the documents. So, for example, the lessons learned document on Northern Alberta's experience, there was the quote, "The teachers were concerned about the inequitable treatment of Kosovars as compared to other refugees. They recommended that all refugees receive the same benefits." And then the final and perhaps most shocking Policy unique to Kosovar refugees concerned repatriation. Kosovars were given 2 years to choose if they wanted to stay in Canada and apply for permanent residence and eventually citizenship or return to Kosovo. The federal government paid all expenses if they did choose to repatriate. Even more surprisingly, they were allowed to make exploratory visits back to Kosovo and make an informed decision whether or not to return. Those who repatriated could take 1 extra month's payment from the resettlement assistance program with them. This policy was extremely controversial, and many sponsors were saddened when their refugees returned, complained that they were not warned of the possibility before making a commitment, and even went so far as to ask whether they could acquire replacement refugees. So this has come up again and again in the interviews as well. There's this lack of understanding from Canadian immigration officials, and I've been asked again and again, why would a Kosovar ever return? Why would they return? We were so sad they returned. We tried to convince them to stay. And this also shows a little bit of this like paternalism and this condescending attitude towards the ability of refugees to make the right decisions for themselves. And then, as mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, when the crisis broke out in Kosovo, the crisis in Sierra Leone had been going on for years. Although much of the media had positively covered Kosovar arrival and treatment, there were some headlines that questioned the perceived double standards. When allegations of favoritism were made, the treatment of refugees from Sierra Leone were often the choice for comparison. An example is found in the June 1999 Wall Street Journal article titled "Kosovars Aren't the Only Refugees," in which the executive director of Human Rights Watch points out that 400,000 refugees had fled Sierra Leone, but no Western power is particularly interested in helping them. Roth describes the discrepancy in aid bluntly. He stated in that article that the contrast with Kosovo is striking. The UNHCR launched an emergency appeal for $8 million for Sierra Leone refugees. So far, the agency has only received $1.3 million. But in Kosovo, the UNHCR is spending an estimated $10 million a week. Allegations of hypocrisy were found in Canadian newspapers as well. In response to Canada's waiving the right of landing fee, there was an article in Toronto Star titled, "Why Waive Unfair Rules Only for Kosovars?" The scathing article points out that 13,000 refugees in Canada are in legal limbo waiting for their landed immigrant status, while Kosovars were automatically accepted. This article ended by asserting, "The heart-wrenching plight of Kosovars has ignited Canadians' desire to help," thus prompting Robillard's show of generosity. Off camera, however, our government drops its smile and refugees shiver in Canadian limbo. At this point, one might wonder, what was the government doing off camera? So the answer is that they were preparing for how to respond to such allegations. Documents released through an access to information request reveal that the government was aware of allegations of hypocrisy and was actively preparing how to respond to those allegations. Many of the pages found in a 700-page access to information release package bold, highlight, and underline that Canada responded because of the UNHCR special appeal. There is an entire section devoted to answers to allegations of hypocrisy titled, "Are Kosovo refugees being favored over other refugees?" So basically, this package was given to government officials to answer when they're answering to the media and being told that they're having double standards. The underlined and bolded answer reads, "The programs Canada offers to other refugees are for resettlement and permanent residence, not emergency evacuation. To compare the two is comparing apples and oranges." Sierra Leone is not mentioned directly, but to the government, refugees for Sierra Leone, like refugees from other nations, were incomparable to Kosovars. So in the 2 years following the arrival of Kosovars, there were many meetings held, after action reports written, and lessons learned documents released. The issue of preferential treatment came up repeatedly. In December 1999, the Canadian Council for Refugees held a lessons learned workshop at their annual conference where groups brainstormed things done well and things to do differently. The unequal treatment of Kosovars came up repeatedly. In a 2001 Lessons Learned report funded by the government, there is a section titled The Uniqueness of the Kosovars versus Sierra Leone, which opens with an assertion that the generous treatment of Kosovars was questioned in some sectors, especially in light of the fact that refugees from Sierra Leone were in equally dire straits, were not given the same options. CIC employees interviewed for the report were defensive of the government's treatment of Kosovars, but notes at these debriefing sessions kept bringing up the issue. So you had this issue where the CIC was really proud of the Operation Parasol, how well it went, and they had bonded with Kosovar refugees, and they had kind of made this part of their legacy, and they were proud of how it went. But then you have some CIC officials, but a lot of volunteer immigration settlement support workers pointing out the ways that other groups weren't receiving the same treatment. So even in my interviews 25 years later, there's this tension between being proud of how they treated them, but also the fact that they were treated better. So in this slide, you can see notes from that debriefing session, and they actually included the actual notes. So this is the notes that they were writing and pinning on the wall, that they have to talk about the difference of treatment of Kosovars, that they didn't want any more double standards, and that they wanted to abolish the right of landing fee. So eventually in 2000, due to intense lobbying and complaints by the Sierra Leonean community and other refugee organizations, the CIC developed a pilot program which brought 250 Sierra Leone refugees to Canada. Like with the Kosovar program, after the ISP pilot finished, there was a federally funded after action report. Unlike the reports on Kosovo refugee policies, the reports do not praise the warm reception that refugees from Sierra Leone received. Instead, the report actually laments the lack of support and media coverage Sierra Leonean refugees received. The report on Sierra Leone refugee program mentions Kosovars directly and complains that they received better treatment. So yes, the CIC eventually did make a program for Sierra Leonean refugees, but the treatment and the policy was completely different. Even when you just look at the numbers, 5,000 refugees plus 2,000 other Kosovars, so 7,000 total Kosovars versus 250 Sierra Leonean refugees. But what's really interesting about this report is that it shows that other refugees were aware that Kosovars were treated better, and this was coming up in conversations about other programs. So to conclude, there is little doubt that Kosovar Albanian refugees received extraordinary and unique treatment in Canada. They benefited from a warm welcome by both the Canadian government and the Canadian public. When compared to the treatment of other refugees from Sierra Leone and the treatment of refugees from Kosovo becomes more apparent. The government's official reasoning was that Kosovars were unique and that they were responding to a UNHCR request. However, not every Canadian bought this explanation, as evidenced when one Toronto Star writer asks, what could have prompted the Canadian government to lavish such largesse on the Kosovars? The UNHCR, despite conflicting reports in the media, seems not to have asked Canadians for such an over-the-top commitment, although our blushing government did try to cast blame on the UN. My presentation today doesn't attempt to answer why Kosovar and Sierra Leonean refugees were treated differently. However, it does assert that they were treated differently. Why is a question that I will cover in a separate paper and a separate presentation. But I will talk about this area for further research. And so my further research will be focusing on the reasons why, and I have started to develop those theories and the understanding of why. But I wanted to leave you with this quote from the After Action report by the federal government published in 2001. This is the first time in Canada that two groups of refugees are settling under such very different circumstances. It is beyond the scope of the study to determine if additional supports for Kosovars and the very warm welcome and continued support from the Canadian public will translate into easier integration and ultimately greater success. What may seem to be success at the end of one's first year in Canada may not translate into success in later years. Enough time has now passed that a critical assessment of whether the preferential treatment made a difference in the actual outcome of their lives in Canada and abroad can now be done, and I'm hoping that that's an area for further research. So basically, in conclusion, on the topic of Kosovo refugees, the last word is far from had. Thank you.
Thank you, Krenare. Thank you to all of the speakers. This has been a very interesting talk. I'm going to stop recording now, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A and discussions. Here we go.